On a frigid December night in 1831, deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a man named Charlie Silver vanished from his one-room cabin. When the search party arrived, they found his body dismembered, burned in the hearth, and buried beneath the floorboards. His killer was his 18-year-old wife, Frankie. The newspapers screamed of a jealous monster who butchered her husband with an axe. But under the laws of that time, Frankie Silver was forbidden from speaking a single word in her own defense at trial. So what really happened in that isolated cabin? Was this the cold-blooded act of a she-devil, or was it the desperate last stand of a terrified girl with no other way out? To understand what happened, you have to understand the world they lived in. This wasn't a town. It wasn't even a settlement. This was the raw, untamed heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains in the early 1830s, a place carved from rock and hardship. Their home was a single-room log cabin perched in a lonely hollow near the rushing waters of the Tow River. The wind didn't just whistle through the gaps in the logs, it moaned. The mountains weren't just a backdrop, they were a green cage, beautiful and deadly, that cut you off from the rest of the world. Life in that cabin was a relentless battle for survival. Their entire universe was contained within those 4 log walls, with a dirt floor under their feet and a stone hearth that was the center of their existence. It was where they cooked, where they slept, and where they found their only defense against the bone-deep cold of a mountain winter. It was a place of immense intimacy, but also a place with nowhere to hide, where every frustration and every dark thought had no room to escape. Charlie Silver was just 19, but he was a man of the woods. He lived by his rifle and his traps, often disappearing for days at a time into the deep forest, chasing deer or checking his lines for beaver and fox. He was young, strong, and restless, a man who understood the language of the wilderness far better than the quiet, contained life of a husband and father. He was the one who brought the outside world and the meat for their table back to that isolated cabin. And in that cabin was Frankie. At 18, she was already a wife and a mother to their 1-year-old daughter, Nancy. While Charlie roamed the mountains, her world shrank to the size of that single room. Her days were measured by the cry of her baby, the crackle of the fire, and the deafening silence of the hollows. That kind of isolation can do strange things to a person. It can sharpen your fears until they have a razor's edge, and it can make the 4 walls of your home feel like a tomb. You can imagine their life was a cycle of hard work, long waits, and the brief, simple relief of reunion. The smell of wood smoke, the sound of an axe splitting firewood, the sight of Charlie returning through the trees with game slung over his shoulder. This was their ordinary life. This was the world they had built, fragile as it was. But the winter of 1831 was coming, and it carried a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. The conflict that ended Charlie Silver's life didn't begin that December night. Its seeds were planted generations before in the very soil of those mountains. You have to remember who these people were. They were the descendants of Scots-Irish pioneers, a people known for their fierce independence and their stubborn refusal to bow to anyone. They hadn't been given this land, they had tamed it. They had wrestled a living from the rocky hillsides, fighting the woods, the winters, and sometimes each other for every acre. This land held memories of blood. It was not a peaceful place. Many of their grandfathers had been over-mountain men, the frontier riflemen who fought with brutal efficiency in the Revolutionary War. They learned a hard lesson in those days, that the only law you can truly count on is the one you enforce yourself. That belief seeped into the ground and rose up like a mountain mist. They distrusted authority from distant towns like Morganton. They settled their own disputes, often with a fist or a rifle, and they kept their secrets locked tight within the family. To be a Silver in that part of the country meant something. They were known as a hardy clan of hunters and trappers, men who knew the mountains like the back of their own calloused hands. They were proud, quick-tempered, and not to be crossed. A Silver man was expected to be the master of his domain, whether that was 100 acres of woodland or the four walls of a one-room cabin. It was a heavy legacy for a young man like Charlie to carry, a pressure to be tough, to be in control, to never show weakness. Frankie came from the Stewart clan, people just as tough and rooted in the mountains as the Silvers. But when she married Charlie, she crossed a line. She became a Silver. In that world, a woman's identity was tied completely to her husband. Her reputation was his reputation. Her duty was to him. This wasn't a partnership of equals. It was a hierarchy as old and as unyielding as the mountains themselves. Frankie wasn't just an isolated wife. She was an outsider who now lived under the formidable shadow of the Silver name. In a place this isolated, the only thing that traveled faster than a winter storm was a rumor. And the air around the Silver cabin had grown thick with them. The community wasn't just a collection of distant neighbors. It was a web of eyes and ears. Every family was connected by blood, marriage, or shared hardship, and they all kept a close watch on one another. The two most watchful sets of eyes belonged to Charlie's father, Jacob, and his brother, John. The Silvers looked after their own, and from the start, they viewed Frankie, the Stewart girl, with a certain suspicion. They saw her as the outsider who had taken one of their boys. Whispers followed Charlie Silver when he came down from the mountains. Some said he had a temper that could flare up like a flash flood, especially when he'd been drinking. Stories of arguments that echoed through the hollow, of a young man growing restless and bitter with the heavy burdens of a wife and child were passed from cabin to cabin. These weren't necessarily malicious tales. They were just observations, the way mountain people took the measure of a man. But each story added another thread to a net that was slowly tightening around that little cabin. The most poisonous rumor of all was that Charlie was planning to leave, not just for a long hunt, but for good. The story went that he'd been saving money and that he planned to take their daughter, Nancy, and head west, where a man could start over. Some versions of the rumor even gave his plan a name, another woman waiting for him somewhere down the trail. For a young wife like Frankie, alone and entirely dependent on her husband, this wasn't just gossip. It was a death sentence. You have to understand, these whispers weren't just idle talk. In a world built on honor and reputation, they were stones being thrown. Frankie would have felt their impact every day. A neighbor who wouldn't quite meet her eye. A sudden silence when she approached a group of women at the creek. The air in that community was charged with unspoken judgments and hidden tensions long before Charlie disappeared. The isolation of her cabin became a social quarantine, leaving her trapped with her fears and a husband who, the whispers said, was ready to abandon her. So when that fateful December arrived, the stage was already set. This wasn't a sudden storm breaking over a clear sky. This was the culmination of months of pressure building up behind a cracking dam. The Silver clan was watching, the neighbors were whispering, and inside that one-room cabin, a silent, bitter war was being waged. The mountains have a way of talking to those who know how to listen, and in the weeks leading up to that Christmas, they were screaming. The old folks would later say the winter of 1831 came on with an unnatural bitterness, a cold that felt personal, like a premonition. They said the screech owls cried from the ridges with a sound that wasn't just a call, but a shiver looking for a spine to run down. In the folklore of those hills, a screech owl calling near a home was a death warning, a sign that a soul was about to be claimed. And the owls, they say, were crying nightly over the Silver cabin. But the most dangerous omen wasn't in the sky. It was sitting across the hearth. Charlie Silver had become a stranger in his own home. The restlessness that had always been part of him had curdled into something darker. He was a caged animal, pacing the confines of his small life, and his eyes were fixed on the distant promise of the West. Every mention of leaving, every coin he saved and hid away, wasn't just a plan, it was a threat. His presence in the cabin was no longer a comfort for Frankie, but a constant, grinding source of tension. He was the human catalyst, the walking, breathing prophecy of the disaster to come. And Frankie felt it. She felt it in the pit of her stomach, a cold knot that had nothing to do with the winter chill. She would stand in the doorway of the cabin with baby Nancy on her hip and look out at the woods. The familiar trees now seemed to cast long, grasping fingers of shadow. The wind whistling through the hollow sounded like it was whispering a warning she couldn't quite understand. It was a suffocating sense of dread, the feeling you get when you're standing on a precipice in the dark. She couldn't have known what was about to happen, but she knew with every fiber of her being that her world was about to be torn apart. The night of December 22nd, 1831, arrived cold and clear. Inside the silver cabin, the fire in the hearth would have been battling the bitter chill, casting flickering shadows that danced on the rough-hewn log walls. The baby, Nancy, was asleep, and in that suffocating little room, the final act began. We will never know the exact words that were spoken between Frankie and Charlie. The fire was the only witness, and it keeps its secrets. But we know that a line was crossed, a point from which there could be no retreat. Perhaps it happened just as the prosecution later claimed. Charlie, his mind set on a new life in the West, finally told her. Maybe he said it calmly, maybe he said it cruelly. He was leaving. He was taking the money they had scraped together. And most devastating of all, he was taking their daughter. For Frankie, this would have been a declaration of war, a sentence of slow starvation and disgrace in the wilderness. In that moment, he ceased to be her husband and became the man who was going to steal her child and destroy her world. Or maybe the mountain legend is true. Maybe Charlie came home that night not with a plan, but with a bottle's worth of rage inside him. Maybe an argument over nothing exploded into violence. The legend whispers that he threatened Frankie, that he even threatened to harm the baby. In this version, Frankie wasn't a woman scorned, she was a mother protecting her young. He wasn't a man with a dream of the West. He was a drunken monster who had brought the terror of the outside world into the one place she was supposed to be safe. Whichever story is true, the result was the same. A final, unbearable choice was forced upon Frankie Silver. And in that cabin, there was a tool. It was an axe. It was not a weapon of murder. It was an instrument of survival, used every single day to split the firewood that kept them from freezing to death. It was a familiar weight in a woman's hands. As Charlie turned his back, or as he fell into a drunken, snoring sleep by the fire, Frankie's hand closed around that smooth, worn handle. The decision was made. The argument was over. The whispers and the fears of the past months all converged into one single, terrible point of focus. The firelight glinted on the polished steel of the axe head. The sound of her own heart was likely a deafening drum in her ears. In the silence that followed the last angry word, she lifted the tool that had kept her family alive, and in the next moment, she would use it to end her husband's life. The first drops of blood were about to fall. We must now step into that cabin, into the moment after the axe has fallen. There was no scream. There was only a dull, wet thud that was nothing like the sound of splitting firewood. It was a soft, final sound. And then, a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the crackle of the fire itself. In that instant, the world stopped. Charlie Silver lay still on the floor, a dark stain spreading slowly from his head into the packed earth. The argument was over. The threats were silenced. And a new, more terrible reality had begun. Imagine the scene. The firelight flickers, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. The baby, Nancy, stirs in her sleep, but does not wake. For Frankie, this must have been a moment of pure, frozen terror. The man who had been her husband, the father of her child, was now just a body. An impossible problem. He was too heavy to move, too large to bury in the frozen winter ground. To leave him was to be discovered instantly. And in that small, isolated space, a desperate, gruesome plan began to form in the mind of a terrified 18-year-old girl. What followed was not an act of rage, but a feat of horrific, back-breaking labor. In the long, cold hours of that December night, Frankie Silver, a small woman by all accounts, began the task of dismantling her husband's body. She used the same tools they used for survival, the axe that had killed him, the knives they used for skinning deer. This was not the work of a monster reveling in gore. It was the frantic mechanical work of someone trying to erase a terrible truth, to make a man disappear. The only witness was the fire in the hearth. That fire, which had been the heart of their home, the source of warmth and life, now became a hungry mouth. Piece by piece, she fed the flames. The smoke that curled up the chimney and out into the cold mountain air would have changed, growing heavy and greasy, carrying a secret that would stain the very stones of the fireplace. The smell in that cabin must have been unimaginable, the air thick with the evidence of her work. Some parts would not burn. For these, she pried up the heavy puncheon floorboards of her own home. She dug into the cold, damp earth beneath the cabin and buried what the fire could not consume. With every handful of dirt she replaced, she was turning her home into a grave, a tomb sealed by her own hands. The pools of blood seeped down between the logs, a silent testament to the slaughter that had occurred just a few feet above. According to the stories, one piece was treated differently. The heart. It wasn't burned or buried with the rest. It was hidden away separately, found later in a hollowed-out stump near the cabin. Why? Was this a final symbolic act of hatred? Or was it something else, a moment of confusion in a mind pushed past the edge of sanity? We will never know. It remains one of the most chilling and inexplicable details of the entire affair. As the first grey light of dawn crept over the mountain ridges, the work was finally done. The fire smoldered with a strange, unnatural heat. The floorboards were back in place. From the outside, the cabin looked just as it always had, a lonely puff of smoke rising into the winter sky. But inside, everything had changed. Frankie Silver was alone with her child, and a secret that was buried in the ashes and under the floor, a secret that could never be contained. Let us, for a moment, try to do what the court never could. Let's try to step inside the mind of Frankie Silver in those terrifying hours. This is not to excuse what she did, but to understand the mechanics of how a human being can arrive at such a brutal act. What switch flips in a person's mind to turn a wife and mother into a killer who could dismember her husband by the light of their own hearth fire? Let's first walk the path the prosecution laid out, the path of the jealous monster. In this version, her mind was a pressure cooker of resentment and fear. The core of her logic was twisted but simple. He is going to destroy me. In her world, a woman abandoned by her husband, her child stolen away, was a non-person. She would be an object of pity and scorn, left to starve or depend on the charity of relatives who already saw her as an outsider. Charlie's plan to go west wasn't just a betrayal, it was an act of annihilation. The switch flipped the moment his threat became real. The instant he said the words, he ceased to be her husband and became a mortal enemy who had to be stopped. What followed was not a crime of passion, but an act of ice-cold logic. The dismemberment, then, was not a frenzy. It was a problem to be solved. A grim, terrible task performed with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had spent her entire life learning how to survive in the wilderness. But there is another path, the one whispered in the mountains. The path of the terrified victim. Here, the logic is not twisted. It is primal. He is going to kill my child. In this scenario, Charlie is not a man with a plan, but a drunken, violent force of nature. The switch flips the instant his rage turns towards the baby's crib. In that second, all thought of wife, husband, law, and future vanishes. There is only the mother animal, cornered in her den, protecting her young from a predator. The axe is not a tool of murder. It is a fang, a claw, a desperate act of defense. What happens next is not cold calculation, but pure, shrieking panic. The dismemberment is a frantic, horrifying attempt to hide what she has done, driven by the certain knowledge that no one will ever believe her. She isn't trying to erase a man. She's trying to erase a moment of justifiable terror that she knows will be her death sentence. After the deed was done, did she feel triumph, relief, or a chilling, bottomless emptiness? If she was the jealous killer, she might have felt a grim sense of victory, the quiet of a problem solved, quickly replaced by the cold fear of discovery. If she was the abused wife, she would have felt nothing but a hollow, ringing terror, a mind shattered by what she'd been forced to do. Only Frankie knew which path she walked in her own mind. And that is the most terrifying part of all. In the days that followed, an unnatural quiet settled over the Silver cabin. It was the silence of a secret. Frankie moved like a ghost through the small room, tending to the baby, stoking the fire, sweeping the dirt floor with a frantic energy. To any neighbor who might pass, she would have looked like a woman waiting for her husband to return from a long hunt. But inside, the air was thick with what was missing. Every creak of the logs, every cry from the baby, must have sounded like an accusation. The outside world soon came knocking. First came the questions, casual at first. Seen Charlie? Frankie had her stories ready, but they shifted like smoke. To one person, she'd say he'd gone off on a long hunting trip and was overdue. To another, she'd let slip a more bitter tale, that he'd taken the money they had saved, abandoned her and the child, and run off to the west. The stories didn't match, and in a community where every detail was noted and remembered, these contradictions were like cracks appearing in a frozen river. Her fight for survival had become a performance. She had to play the part of the wronged wife, worried but also resentful. She had to manage her grief, her fear, and her lie all at once, under the constant, watchful gaze of the community. Little Nancy was her anchor, the living reason for what she had done. But the child was also a constant reminder of the man who was gone, making the charade that much harder to maintain. But Charlie's family, especially his father Jacob and his brother John, they weren't buying it. They knew Charlie. He was a skilled woodsman, yes, but he was also a Silver. He wouldn't just vanish without a word, leaving his rifle and his dogs behind. Abandoning his family was one thing, but leaving his hunting tools was something else entirely. It was a detail that was fundamentally wrong, a note so out of tune it made their teeth ache. Their suspicion grew from a quiet unease into a certainty. Something terrible had happened to their boy. So they started the hunt. It wasn't a formal posse of lawmen, not at first. It was the clan, the family, taking matters into their own hands. They gathered their neighbors and began to search the woods, the creeks, the ravines around the cabin. Days turned into a week. They found no tracks, no sign of a hunting camp, no trace of a man lost in the wilderness. And with every failed search, all eyes turned back to the one place every trail led, the little log cabin where Frankie Silver waited with her shifting stories and a fire that never seemed to go out. The hunt for a missing man was about to become a search for a body. The moment the first piece of Charlie Silver's body was pulled from beneath the cabin floor, the whispers in the community turned into a roar. A line was drawn in the dirt, as clear and deep as the Tow River itself. You were either for the Silvers or you were for the Stewarts. There was no middle ground, no place for neutrality. The murder of one man had become a war between two clans, and every single person in that part of the mountains was forced to choose a side. The general store, the churchyard, the grist mill, these places became the tense gathering points for the factions. The Silver camp was loud, fueled by righteous fury and raw grief. Charlie was their son, their brother, their friend. They told the story of a cold-blooded she-devil who had lured their boy to his doom. Neighbors who had hunted with Charlie, men who owed Jacob Silver a favor, and those who simply believed in the old law of an eye for an eye, they all stood with the Silvers, their voices demanding justice, which to them meant a rope. On the other side, the Stewart clan circled the wagons. Frankie was their daughter, their blood. They may have been horrified, they may have been confused, but they would not abandon one of their own to the mercy of the Silvers. Their camp was quieter, more watchful. Their loyalty gave rise to a powerful conspiracy of silence. Many people knew Charlie had a temper. Many had heard the rumors of his planned abandonment, but who would dare speak of it now? To defend Frankie, even to suggest there might be another side to the story, was to paint a target on your own back. The Silvers were a powerful family, and their anger was a dangerous fire. Fear became a currency, and silence was the only way to stay safe. This division wasn't just abstract, it played out in small, defining actions. Frankie's own mother and brother were immediately suspected of helping her, of choosing the loyalty of blood over the law of men. A neighbor who might have seen them near the cabin that night would have looked the other way, his silence a shield for himself and an alibi for them. In contrast, another neighbor, seeing the greasy smoke pouring from the chimney for days, finally worked up the courage to tell Jacob Silver his suspicions. That act wasn't just sharing information, it was a public declaration of allegiance, a brave or foolish step, depending on who you asked. The community had fractured, turning lifelong friends into wary strangers and neighbors into potential enemies. After the verdict, Frankie Silver was a dead woman walking. But her family, the Stewart clan, refused to accept it. To them, the trial in Morganton had been a farce, a piece of legal theater orchestrated by the Silvers. Justice wasn't a blindfolded woman with a scale, it was a rope with a noose, and it was meant for their daughter. So her father, Isaiah, and her uncle concocted a desperate plan born from love and defiance. One night, a set of boys' clothes was smuggled into Frankie's cell. She was a small woman, and with her hair cut short, she could pass. They broke her out of the Morganton jail, and she vanished into the night. The Blue Ridge Mountains that had cradled her in her youth now became her last, best hiding place. With her father as her guide, Frankie fled back into the familiar labyrinth of ridges and hollows. They moved like ghosts, following game trails and creek beds, sleeping in caves and thickets. For a short, breathless time, she was free. She was no longer Frankie Silver, the convicted killer. She was just a boy, lost in the woods, a shadow among shadows. The mountains, which had been her cage, were now her sanctuary, their ancient silence her only shield. But back in the flatlands, a firestorm of rage had erupted. A posse was formed, led by the sheriff, but fueled by the cold fury of the Silver clan. They would not be cheated of their justice. A reward was posted, a substantial sum of money that echoed through the hills and hollows. It was a poison seed planted in the heart of the community. Suddenly, every neighbor, every old family friend had a price tag on their loyalty. The hunt for Frankie Silver became a hunt for gold. The chase was a desperate game of cat and mouse played out across miles of unforgiving terrain. The posse had numbers and dogs, but Frankie and her father had knowledge. They knew the secret paths, the places a stranger would never find. For days, they eluded capture, living off the land, always moving. You can just imagine the terror of it, the constant listening for the baying of hounds on the wind, the fear of a snapped twig giving away their position, the exhaustion that ground them down day by day. Finally, starving and exhausted, they were forced to seek help. They made their way across the county line into Rutherford, to the home of a family they thought they could trust. They took in the weary old man and the quiet, haunted-looking boy with him. For a moment, there was warmth, a hot meal, a chance to rest. But Frankie could not disguise her eyes. They were the one part of her that told her true story. The family recognized her, and the lure of the reward money was too strong. A quiet message was sent. The moment of capture wasn't a fierce firefight in the woods. It was a quiet, sickening betrayal. The sheriff and his men simply walked into the cabin. There was no struggle. Frankie, exhausted and cornered, knew the game was over. She had been run to ground not by the lawman's skill, but by a neighbor's greed. The mountains had given her a brief, wild freedom, but in the end, it was the people who lived among them who sealed her fate. The trial of Frankie Silver in March of 1832 was not a search for truth. It was a public spectacle. You have to picture the Morganton courthouse. It wasn't a sterile, quiet chamber of law. It was a tinderbox packed with bodies, smelling of wet wool and simmering hatred. Armed guards stood at the doors, not just to keep the prisoner in, but to keep the community from tearing itself apart. On one side of the room sat the Silver clan, their faces carved from stone, their eyes burning with a demand for vengeance. On the other side, huddled together, were the Stuarts, silent and grim, watching their world crumble. And in the middle of it all sat Frankie Silver. She was a small, silent figure, almost a child, swallowed up by the heavy machinery of the law. The most brutal fact of her trial was not the evidence against her, but the gag that the law itself had placed over her mouth. Under the legal customs of that time, an accused person could not testify in their own defense. She was a ghost at her own trial, forced to listen as lawyers and witnesses constructed the story of her life and her crime, while she was forbidden to speak a single word. She could not confirm, she could not deny, she could not explain. The prosecution had an easy task. The lawyer laid out the evidence piece by horrifying piece. He presented the bone fragments from the hearth, the blood-soaked earth from beneath the floorboards, the testimony of the searchers. He painted a simple, damning picture of a jealous, monstrous woman who had butchered her husband in a fit of rage because he planned to leave her. It was a story that was clean, brutal, and easy for a jury to understand. What could her lawyers do? They were hamstrung, fighting a ghost story with a mountain of physical evidence. They could argue points of law, they could question the witnesses, but they could not put their client on the stand to tell her side of the story. They couldn't tell the jury about Charlie's temper or about a potential threat to the baby, because the only person who could testify to that was legally silenced. They were fighting a fire with their bare hands. The verdict, when it came, was no surprise. The jury barely had to deliberate. The word guilty echoed in the tense courtroom. A wave of grim satisfaction rolled through the Silver side of the room. On the Stuart side, there was only the quiet devastation of the inevitable. The judge, his duty clear, sentenced Frances Silver to be hanged by the neck until she was dead. The law of men had spoken. The formal process of justice, as understood by the courts in Morganton, was complete. But looking at that small, muzzled woman being led away in chains, one has to ask the question that has haunted these mountains ever since. Was justice actually served? Or was it simply the final formal act of a tragedy whose ending had already been written in blood and ashes? The day Frankie Silver was hanged, a heavy silence fell over Morganton. The spectacle was over. But for the families involved, the story was just entering its next long chapter. For the Silvers, the verdict was not a victory, and the execution was not a release. They had their justice, their eye for an eye, but it didn't bring Charlie back. The horror of his death became a dark stone in the foundation of their family, a cautionary tale whispered to future generations about the dangers of marrying an outsider. The name Frankie Silver became a curse in their homes, a synonym for the ultimate betrayal. The justice they had won felt as cold and empty as a winter grave. For Frankie's family, the Stuarts, the shame was a poison that seeped into the ground they walked on. They were now the kin of a convicted killer, the first woman ever hanged in North Carolina. They bore the weight of her crime in every sideways glance at the general store, in every conversation that stopped when they approached. Her father, Isaiah, who had risked everything to break her out of jail, was a broken man. He lived out his days under a cloud of grief and suspicion. The family that had been proud and independent was now marked, forced to live with the consequences of an act they did not commit, but could never escape. And what of the child at the heart of it all? Little Nancy Silver was now an orphan, Her legacy a horror story. Her mother had murdered her father. She was raised by relatives, growing up in the shadow of a tragedy she was too young to remember but could never outrun. She was the living, breathing embodiment of that terrible night, a constant reminder of the blood that connected the two feuding families. Her life would be forever defined by the actions of her parents, a quiet testament to the innocent lives that are shattered in the wake of such violence. In the wider community, a collective amnesia began to set in. The story was too ugly, the divisions it created too deep. To heal, the community had to forget. People stopped talking about Frankie Silver. Her name was scrubbed from polite conversation. The brutal murder, the sensational trial, the dramatic escape, it was all pushed down, buried under the relentless demands of survival. The scar on the community was deep, and the only way to live with it was to pretend it wasn't there, to cover it with a thick blanket of silence. But in the mountains, stories don't die. They just go to sleep, waiting for the right voice to wake them up again. And what is left of this story today? If you go looking for the physical traces of Frankie Silver, you will find mostly ghosts. The one-room cabin is long gone, its logs rotted back into the earth, reclaimed by the deep woods of the Tow River Valley. The forest has swallowed it whole, erasing the scar from the land, but not from the memory. The exact spot where the gallows stood in Morganton is a matter of debate, likely a paved street corner or a parking lot now, a place people pass every day without knowing they are walking over ground that was once consecrated by a terrible and public death. You will not find a tombstone for Frankie Silver. After the hanging, her body was likely given to her father, who buried her in an unmarked grave, perhaps in the family plot, perhaps at a lonely crossroads, as was the custom for those who died in disgrace. The exact location is a secret that died with him. In a way, this lack of a final resting place is her most fitting memorial. It has allowed her to become more than a historical figure. She is a legend, a ghost without a home, a whisper that still haunts the hollows. But the most powerful echo isn't in a place, it's in the people. The Silvers and the Stewarts still live in those mountains. For over a century, the two families lived in a state of tense silence, the memory of the murder a deep, uncrossable chasm between them. But in recent decades, the descendants of both Frankie and Charlie, many of them descended directly from their orphaned daughter Nancy, have begun to come together. They hold joint reunions, not to forget the tragedy, but to finally acknowledge their shared, tangled, and bloody roots. They are living proof that the wounds of the past, even the deepest ones, can eventually begin to heal. And yet, the most enduring monument to this entire tragedy is not made of stone or of flesh and blood. It is made of words and a simple, haunting melody. The ballad of Frankie Silver, whether it was her confession or her father's creation, became her true headstone. It escaped the mountains and was carried across the country by folk singers and storytellers. The ballad is what kept her story alive, ensuring that even when the community tried to bury it in silence, her name would never truly be forgotten. The people tried to move on, the buildings fell, and the graves were lost, but the mountains remember. And in the quiet hollows, if you listen closely, you can still hear the echo of that lonesome, tragic song. So we come back to the question we asked at the very beginning, standing in the cold ashes of that 1831 cabin. Was Frankie Silver a cold-blooded monster of jealousy? Or was she a terrified victim of abuse who made a desperate last stand? The honest answer is that we will never know. The law of her time did not care about her reasons, her fears, or her side of the story. It cared only about the horrifying evidence found under her floorboards. Because she was legally forbidden to speak, we are left forever with two competing ghosts, the ghost of a brutally murdered man and the ghost of his wife's untold truth. The official record calls her a killer. The mountain legend calls her a victim. The reality is buried with her in that unmarked grave, and it will remain there forever. This story, then, is more than just a grim tale of murder. It is a profound and chilling lesson about the power of a voice and the terrible consequences of silence. Frankie Silver was silenced by the law, but an entire community was silenced by fear and by a fierce clan loyalty that chose sides instead of seeking truth. Her story warns us what happens when justice becomes a synonym for vengeance, and when a person's humanity is stripped away until they are nothing more than the sum of their worst possible act. It is a story not just of cruelty, but of the immense weight of the past in these mountains, and how a single act of violence can send ripples of grief and division down through the generations. The court of men gave its verdict. The whispers of the mountains gave another. And now, you have heard the evidence, the rumors, and the legends that surround one of Appalachia's darkest and most enduring tragedies. The truth itself is lost to the wind that blows through the Tow River Valley. But the story, the warning, the mystery, the sorrow of it all, that story is now yours to keep. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story.